For decades, he has meticulously hand-painted his interpretation of the ski slopes all around the world, supplying a unique service of which he has become the king. Painting tree by tree, he communicates the complex terrain, making it immediately accessible. His new book, Man Behind the Maps, is getting great reviews and is available online. What follows is a portion of a conversation with James Niehues. Real quick, biographically, you're from here in Colorado. You're from Western Slope, and so you grew up in.
Yeah, I grew up. I grew up in the Fruta area in down in Loma, Colorado.
And so that whole thing of living and kind of understanding mountains and how you get around them, that's probably a pretty common second nature thing for you. That sense of understanding terrain is something that is probably pretty hardwired for someone that grew up in that area.
Well, that's right. And when, I just love the Colorado National Monument. My dad had a boat, and we would go down the Colorado River down towards Utah, and so and we'd get out and hunt a lot, and then I did a lot of hiking. So yeah, and the fact that I just fell in love with landscapes and wanted to be a landscape painter.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was going through some of your biographical information, I was intrigued by the fact, and it seemed like you're just like the perfect confluence of several streams to end up becoming the Niehues that we needed in the world. One was that you had done modeling and illustrations for trials. That when you were, and that was here in Colorado, in Denver, and it kind of struck me. It's like, well, you can't fudge then. You have to be precise in your visualizations.
True, but we spent an awful lot of time just putting together just boards that would be put on in front of the jurors, and they were nothing more than a type, and we would press type. I can remember putting those things together forever. And then there'd be the interesting jobs. We'd have some, I can remember illustrating how a lady was in the front seat and napping in the back position, all spread out, and she had her seatbelt on. But whenever the crash occurred or whenever the hard braking occurred, it threw her into the windshield, and killed her. And the seatbelt just was down around her waist. So, and I illustrated the different how her body would have come forward and hit the windshield, or something like that, in a lot of different types of situations.
So there's a lot of visualizing the complex, but at the same time, you did a whole lot of Alfec transferable letters and putting up some description on foam core. Yeah,
that's right. There wasn't no accuracy there. Just get them looking nice.
The other thing that struck me was that when you were you had lived up in Junction, and that you had been in advertising, and the one thing that always kind of immediately hits me is that tends to be a business where you have one chance to get a visualization right, or at least to get the right tone over to the viewer. Is you don't have a chance to kind of redo or visually apologize or do 2.0. What you put out has to hit the mark, or as darn close to it as you can.
Yeah, you're always aiming for the mark. It doesn't mean you always hit it, but there's always a little different slant on things. But back then, we'd do paste ups and spend a lot of time just pasting stuff together. Today you get on the internet, or you get on the computer, and you put it together rather fast, and everything's straight and level, and you don't worry about anything. But back then, we had to use T-squares and draw our lines with an ink pen and not a technical pen, and get our corners square and everything else. So it is a lot more tedious in those days.
That craftsmanship element is it's one of those things that begins to inform everything you do. And I think obviously in your instance too, it ended up building a real set of skills that you're fluid in that kind of detail stuff pretty fast too.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. There's so many things that, well, it's just like the airbrushing. I used to airbrush old photographs and take the scratches out of them, and even just for individuals would come in and have an old photograph of grandma and grandpa, and there'd be a great big tear right down through his forehead, so you'd have to come back and retouch it and get it to look like also the surface of the print, so that it didn't look like it was retouched. It was exactly like the photograph and on the paper that it was on. So there's a lot of different detail that, yes, I learned early. I didn't go to art school. Very little. I had a few classes, but the ones that I had, they would more or less say, well, okay, let's be creative. Whenever you get creative, let's do something. You had a whole semester to figure out what you're going to do and so forth. And out in the real world, it's the customer comes in, they want it tomorrow.
That's right.
And you got to produce. You can't sit around and wait for some creativity to develop. You just got to do it.
Yeah, I'm afraid in the lieu of the muse not showing up, sometimes you just have to be able to craft and get there on the fly. that's the hard.
Oh yeah,
that's the hard, fast reality of things. That's for sure. I was wondering.
That's right, Curtis.
I was wondering. Now, we have dealt for the longest time in antique and vintage maps, and Hal Shelton has been a figure that we've known about and even celebrated by Library of Congress. He got noted as one of the 20th century's top cartographers. And it's funny, I went back and was taking a look at some of Hal's work back in his USGS days and then into his ski days. And it still strikes me as what he was hitting on back in the 40s, and work he did with Jeppesen was... yeah. I have no idea how he did it. He's got views of the world that are done accurately, and how did he do that? I don't know. Yeah.
I'm more artist than cartographer, really.
Yeah, he reached some kind of amazing kind of crescendo point for this style of visualization, his kind of shaded relief approach, which I think you kind of end up becoming the culmination of, is a very intuitive but very rich and dense way to understand a complex place. With Hal, by comparison, it starts to feel real sciencey and data-based. Yours feels like, oh, this is someplace I could go experience. It kind of has a kind of playground quality that you can imagine yourself in it.
Oh, well, good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. That's very good. That's, I think, a very important part of it is to showcase the terrain that you're going to ski in or hike in. Mm-hmm. And I really try to replicate, whether it's a brush that you're walking through or if you're walking through tall trees. So it's something that I just try to do so that people, while they're out there, also can find their way around by associating themselves with the foliage that's around, or the steepness, or obviously a stream or something.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've heard tell that photos are incredibly important for you. You always, before you start out on a project, you'll go out and fly it, get a couple thousand feet above it, and get some general shots of it. But that's not all. Can you explain a bit about your process of how you begin working through on a project?
Well, today with the internet, I'll go on Google Earth and really review the ski area and just view it from all sides. And then I come back and give the client a quote from that. And then we'll go ahead and get the aerial photography. The Google Earth is good to review, but it just isn't very good. At least it's not what I'm looking for whenever you look at the... it'll soften out your ravines, and it'll, this is probably 30 feet off in a lot of cases, and you don't see the cliffs, you just don't see any of the vertical stuff. So once I get the aerial photographs, I'll fly it, like you say, 2,000 feet above it the first pass, and then I'll drop down to about 500 feet above the summit, and I'll take more detailed shots of all the sections of the mountain. And then I'll kind of fly away from it and get the horizon in behind it and work and make sure I've got photographs of all the terrain that might not seem like it would be in the final illustration, but it may be. So I get it. And then I'll fly on down about mid-mountain and get the rest of the detail, the lower mountain and the base. And from that, I'll go ahead and really get by that time, I pretty much have it envisioned on how it's going to be. And I'll go ahead and do a thumbnail sketch that'll show the lift lines and the amount of space I need in between for all the trails, and it'll also be turning all those slopes towards the viewer, so all those distortions will be configured in that thumbnail. Once they approve a thumbnail, then it goes to the final comprehensive sketch.
I'm glad you mentioned distortion, because that was one of the terms that we came up in discussing your work, was a friendly distortion. That it was.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not too much that you're going to ever lose some sense of orientation or proportion, but it's just enough to give you some sense of placement. Which it's like, how do you do that? But it sounds like this is a synthesis that kind of happens as the more you kind of get numerous views of the slope, then it starts to come together inside. It starts to gel on its own.
Okay. Yeah, it really does. Yeah. I think the distortions are very important, and it's why the computer imagery is not as flexible, and what a cartographer is one that I've always thought guides somebody. It's a guide. It doesn't have to be, facts and figures exactly like it is, but it needs to be able to lead somebody and show them the course. And so that's what I really lean heavily on. And like you say, I never distort something so that it's so far off that it's unbelievable, or like the skier is skiing along and saying, wow, I just skied for 100 feet, and on this map it looks like it's half a mile across here. You got to keep it relative.
Yeah.
And whenever they ski it, they look at it and it seems all very, very natural. And that's what I strive to do.
That's awesome. It's funny. That was, I think, probably the biggest gift that you have is help. We were joking around that he helps people typically from lowland go to a high deoxygenated place and try and recognize quickly where they're at, which is that is a superhuman ability, I think, at that point.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, I guess. I hadn't heard it that way.
All I could think of was a family coming back east, and innately they grab your maps. They can do a quick once-over, and these are folks that I'm sure if you asked them a complicated question or to do long math, they would have to back out and go get a hit of oxygen. But with your stuff, they're able to go ahead and take a look, and there's enough symbology there that they can orient themselves quickly. And it's not a matter of you have to learn a whole key of directions or symbols or anything along those lines. But it's you basically have gotten a simple language to render complex things, which, man, that's a superpower. When you met Bill Brown, did he use kind of the same approach and techniques as what you've developed?
Oh, yes, very.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. I kind of learned under him and studied, and so it's very much the same way.
Okay.
And he learned that way from Hal Shelton. So
yeah. You'd mentioned it's funny. I was looking at kind of heroes when it comes to depicting complex topography and things that have that same rich quality of being obvious. You look at it and you know what you're looking at. I've never made it to Denali, but if I look at Bradford Washburn's map of all things Mount McKinley, it was called then, I know exactly. I know why he took that route and how it happened. You'd mentioned Heinrich Baron, the German illustrator. Or Swiss.
Baran.
Yeah, Baran.
Yeah, Swiss.
Yeah. How did those guys kind of play an influence? Was it kind of a style thing or color range thing?
Well, I think the thing that impressed me the most, as it seems to have with you too, is the instant ability to understand what you're looking at and saying, "Wow, yeah, that canyon's really deep," or and that's what I've always strove for. I can remember back, I did one of my very first regionals was Jackson Hole, and it'd been out for a little while, and they'd go back to shows back east, and they'd always had trouble explaining to people what Jackson Hole was, the region, the valley. Mm-hmm. And I got a phone call one day, and the guy on the other end was really excited, and he says, "You know something? We went back to the show with your illustration, and we didn't have to explain anything. They just saw it." And that was the biggest compliment I could ever get, is it explains it. That's what I like to do.
That's magical. God, that's magical. Have there ever been any specific and you've been, good Lord, you've been all around the globe. You've done a ton of work in places like New Zealand, and you've been to Russia. You've been all over the place. Have there been any jobs that were more challenging than others, that there was just something about it that was harder to kind of render?
Well, of course, to render the ski mountains, you got to turn all the slopes towards you, and so the more there are, and if you look at the different directions that they might flow in, well, I'll take for instance Park City Mountain and the canyons now, mm-hmm. all in one, and they're just many different things that you've got to turn and show skiing down both sides. So it's that one was particularly difficult. And another one that I just finished up was Mount Bachelor. Mm-hmm. And on Mount Bachelor, there's 360-degree skiing, and I really didn't want an overhead view because I really don't like ski runs that whenever it shows that the runs that it should be running down are actually running up page. So, I try to turn everything so that the runs are running down page, and that was one that I could do basically because all the runs on the south side are not really cut runs. They're tree runs, and so I could be general with it, and they can go ahead and put their lines down through there and indicate the name of the run. So that made that possible. I think you get into like New Zealand and well, particularly Australia. All right, they just have they have a tree down there called a snow gum tree, and so to illustrate that tree was challenging to me. And so Perishers only got 500 feet vertical, and to do Perisher and exaggerate that a little bit, I chose to do a very early morning scene that would cast a lot of shadows. And so that turned out well on that one.
That's awesome. Now, briefly, when it comes to older approaches to it, I think Hal Shelton there was almost two ways he would do it. One was kind of a promotional thing, and then the other was for kind of orienting you on the slopes. Do you kind of have that premise too, that there's kind of two directions? One is trying to give just an overall view and kind of draw people in, and the other one is, I'm trying to help you get down the slope. Are there two ways of doing it?
Well, and that is the one way to do it, I think. You can't, why just put out some lines and say, all right, this is how to get down the mountain, and not even show what you're skiing through or what you're enjoying. In the early days, I really felt it was more important to be accurate than beautiful, but I couldn't pass up getting it beautiful too. So today, with everything that we have, all the technology and everything, I think probably the accuracy is not maybe not as important to the ski resorts as to beautify their area, to show and to promote their area with the beauty of it. Mm-hmm. So I'm really kind of hinging back on maybe some of the importance has shifted to portraying an area really beautifully.
Yeah, I think you've got something not just descriptive, but you capture a lot of that intangible goodness of a place that. Oh,
well, thank you.
Yeah, it's all those. And I have to say, a lot of it still kind of resonates for me with your kind of color usage. That there becomes this kind of resonant warmth. Somehow you've tapped into that kind of Maxfield Parrish kind of quality of something magical about a specific area. It's a wonderful thing to behold.
Well, thanks. My color palette has really changed through the years, but I've always tried to keep it realistic, and mine is perhaps a little greener than it is greener than it is in the wintertime. But Hal had told me early on, he says, paint the colors as you see them from the ground, not as you see them from the air. If you get an aerial photograph in the wintertime, it's just all blues, and there's just not a lot of color. And so
that's interesting.
That's what I did.
So, and I suppose that's another fine point of building that psychological connection of that color scheme of how you would see it as you saw it on the ground. That's fascinating. Okay.
Well, and I'll also paint the top part of the mountain bluer than the bottom part. It just shows more elevation, and as you get lower on the mountain, not only do you have less snow if it's been warm days, or you can get a frosting on the top of the mountain, and the bottom will be clear of snow. So things like that, that I just like to bring out.
Awesome. Man, I should admit, I should have mentioned too, I have a couple of guys that have come in that they've always kept all of their ski maps from when they've gone places, which I found, I found intriguing. And that you live on in people's hearts and homes many times over, just because it was interesting that the way that they remembered your experience was your map. Like, that's how they connoted all that kind of, that dense amount of memories, and getting a good instance of really good powder was, and I kept the map, which I thought that was so cool. So cool.
That's the most gratifying part of the whole thing is, I go to these ski shows and sign books, and it's repeatedly they'll come up. They're so excited, and they say, I've got my whole room is covered with your maps, and it just is it's just surprising to me how many people express that. There couldn't be much, I can't think of a medium or an artist anywhere that has more gratification than I do, because they're out there, they're being used, they're being folded up and put in pockets, but that's my art, and I'm really, really very glad that I could have done it.
Our thanks to James Niehues. We sure appreciated a chance to chat. You can visit him at his webpage. You spell Niehues, Niehues, jamesniehues.com. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.